Chapter 9. The Parting of Miyagame. Severe though it had been, the punishment of the first 2 weeks was negligible compared to what came later. As our conditioning improved, the daily running regimen increased from 2 or 3 to 5 miles. Eventually we were running over 8 miles, and those who fell behind were bludgeoned with rifle butts. During Taiko Binta, instead of exchanging fist blows in the face, we now used shoes with hobnails, and the face of every trainee bore lacerations and rips, especially around the corners of the mouth. One man in the adjoining barracks nearly lost an eye. Except for Sundays, the torment was almost incessant. By the first month's end, many in our group were breaking emotionally, beyond remedy. Continual pain, continual humiliation, continual pressure, endless stress. It could not be endured forever. The 2 remaining months of basic training loomed like centuries. I did not believe it possible that all of us could survive. And I was right. Early in the 2nd month, 6 men from our original group deserted. They scaled the barbed wire enclosure and fled only to be captured a short while later. One of them remained free for several days, hiding in the mountains, stealing vegetables from the farms by night. Then he was apprehended by the civilian police near his home in Hongo City. In order to verify his identity, they delivered him to his family. What ignominy! "We are sorry," the police explained, "but this man has betrayed his country, and we have no recourse but to return him to Hiro." He was then led away in handcuffs. Deserters from all branches of the military were sent to army stockades where they were at the mercy of the vicious MPs. Reports had reached us, in fact, that prisoners were often tortured to death with no recourse whatever to justice and a fair trial. Stockade authorities simply lied with impunity, fabricating reasons for the demise of those they killed. They were rarely questioned. For all of us, time squirmed by with the speed of an earthworm, but those who didn't collapse under the ordeal were gradually becoming tougher, hardened in both mind and body. Somehow we made it through the gristmill of the 2nd month. 2/3 of our basic training was behind us now, and that imparted encouragement. During my weeks at Hiro, I had grown a bit and was grimly satisfied, even proud, that I had withstood some of the worst they had to offer. I was one of the best in calisthenics and endurance running, and I continued to excel at glider practice, along with my other training classes. I had now acquired several friends who seemed impressed with my former accomplishments as national glider champion, and the news was being spread. No denying, I enjoyed the recognition, and my general outlook was rapidly improving. Then came a shock that left me demoralized for days. One evening, having just polished my boots, I strolled to the latrine. As I approached the door, however, a recruit informed me that it was locked. "Out of order, I guess," he said, and wandered off. Feeling an urgent need to enter, I seized the doorknob, turning it and giving a vigorous shove. "Anybody in there?" I called. No answer. Maybe, I decided, the snake had locked it simply to create a little more confusion and discomfort. It was definitely the sort of trick he might pull. I called again. No answer, but the lock was a flimsy one, and my need for relief was quickly increasing. Glancing about to ensure that no one was watching, I reared back on one leg and crashed my boot heel against the lock. It creaked and the door shuddered. Once again I glanced about, then assaulted the lock even harder. This time it gave, and the door fell open. I entered hastily, leaving the light off. Almost simultaneously I collided with something. "Pardon me," I mumbled. No answer. A presence seemed to loom before me in the dark. Backing toward the door, I blurted, "Who is it? What's wrong?" Someone was there. I had touched someone, felt human flesh. Yet he simply remained there in frozen silence like a madman. Roiling darkness, the stench, the silence, all mingled ominously. Groping for the wall switch, I flipped it on. The light exploded, revealing a limp figure dangling from the rafter by a rope. The rope was knotted around his neck, and he was still swinging slightly from our contact. This was my first direct encounter with death. The face was purple and bloated, the eyes bulging slightly and egg-white with no sign at all of the irises. In my shock, I failed to recognize him. Then the realization enveloped me. Miyagame, a recruit I had talked to more than once. Yes, I remembered now, always quiet and withdrawn, rather frail. Yes, Miyagame, the one that idiot Hancho had cuffed before his family on Visitors' Day. He was still swinging, and I stared in horrified fascination, stupefied, mesmerized, paralyzed in the clutches of a nightmare. Back and forth, back and forth. Then came the panic. Maybe, by some remote possibility, he was still alive. Somewhere in that greying flesh there might be a tiny pulse of life. I was wasting precious time. Stumbling backward, I whirled and rushed into the nearest barracks. "Quick, give me your trench knife," I commanded a startled recruit. "Nani?" He blinked at me stupidly. "What is it?" Seizing the knife in its sheath on the pack atop his locker, I shouted, "There's somebody in the latrine, a dead man, hanged himself." The recruit arose from his seat on the cot, looking as though he had accidentally swallowed arsenic. "Come on," I ordered. "Help me for God's sake." Dumbly he followed, and I had the quick impression that he thought I'd gone mad. Then he saw Miyagame and began to exclaim and mumble incoherently. "Cut the rope," I said, and he complied as I hefted the limp body. An instant later the rope was severed, and Miyagame collapsed over my shoulder, staggering me. "Help me lay him down." The recruit complied. Feverishly, I turned the body on its stomach, straddled it, and began artificial respiration, pressing rhythmically on his back as we had been trained to do. Minutes passed, how long I didn't know. "You're wasting your time, Kuwahara. He's dead and gone," a voice said. It was the snake, and a dozen men were clustered about us. Almost inaudibly someone murmured, "Anyway, he is happy now." Swiftly the news spread, and the following day I learned through Nakamura that Miyagame had left a letter addressed to his family, an apology for having dishonoured them and begging their forgiveness for dying ahead of you before my rightful time. His final words read, "I await you in the next world." This was another breaking point for several in our group. Now only the fittest would survive. Miyagame's suicide had evoked a terrible psychological effect. My own special glow of hope, pride, and strength vanished. What good would it do to grow strong anyway? After basic, there would simply be more punishment, more harassment, more humiliation, more and more and more. Then what, provided it ever ended? I would probably die for an emperor who had never even heard the name Kuwahara, who would never have the faintest inkling of my existence. My naive conception of heroism soured, putrefied. In its place was the bloated face of Miyagame with its blind, egg-white eyeballs, always swinging. Visions began to assert themselves, flashbacks of Miyagama being cuffed before his family, all of them burning with fear and shame. And always, after that, the dark, stinking latrine and the lifeless body. After Shoto Rappa, the inspections and ongoing punishment, I would lie face down on my cot, gripping my mattress, trying to exclude the visions I knew would come. At times, I would jolt to wakefulness in the night as though falling. At times, I would cry out, bolting upright, staring wildly into the dark. Always the corpse that had once been Miyagame, swinging, always swinging, tossing, moaning, clutching my mattress as though it were a raft on the waves. I would clamp my eyes desperately, only to embrace the vision more fiercely. Eventually, it began to fade, enshrouded in the mist of time, partly because others had decided to follow our friend. Watanabe, a recruit from my own quarters, went next in the same way. Then others, not only with ropes, but also bayonets. One leaped off the water tower, crushing out his life on the asphalt assembly area below. 9 men from our original group of 60 took their own lives during my basic training. Suicide. It was a way out, perhaps the only answer. Could it hurt any more to hang than to be bludgeoned with a rifle butt? Could it hurt more to impale oneself on a bayonet than to hug a tree naked, clinging to the cold, rough bark while your back was lashed? Surely the bayonet, used properly, would be far more swift. Irresistibly, I began to toy with different possibilities, then to plan more seriously. Slashed wrists, I decided, would probably be the best way, or maybe the jugular vein. Hone my trench knife to a fine razor edge. Then, my obsession with Miyagame was being replaced by an obsession with Kuwahara. Yet each day I could feel my body toughening, feel the swelling in my biceps, triceps, and deltoids as I performed my push-ups. I could now do 100 push-ups perfectly, because anything less laid us vulnerable to the whip. I could do 20 perfect pull-ups, sit-ups indefinitely. Each day I felt the growing strength in my legs as we ran. 10 miles a day now, and always I heard my father's voice calmly commanding me to return a man, a samurai. No, I could not dishonour my father by taking the easy way out, not my family, not the illustrious name of Kuwahara. Only 2 more weeks now, and spring was coming. The sunlight increased daily, dazzling our eyes as we ran, transforming the distances into tantalizing patches of blue. Tiny lakes and ponds as blue as the sky that evaporated enchantingly as we drew near. Frustratingly. Yet I felt that I could run forever. I could keep right on through life, the life that fate or the gods had decreed. Nothing could stop me now until my appointed time. 1 week left. The punishment had reached its zenith, but the fittest had survived. We could not be vanquished, and the pig had attained his grand objective. The end was nigh at hand, and we who had prevailed felt a powerful camaraderie. Nakamura was like a brother, frank, sometimes outspoken, courageous, yet also highly empathic. How I admired him. Oke and Yamamoto invariably lifted our spirits. Irrepressible, they always rallied, seeming to take strength from each other, then imparting it to the rest of us, even in the face of disaster. Gokudo, great pranksters, both of them, the ultimate extroverts. By now, strangely enough, some of the punishment itself had become humorous. Occasionally, when our hancho were in their more mischievous moods, they would put us through routines that were far more ludicrous than painful. One of Sakigawa's favourites was to have a recruit climb atop his wall locker where he would squat, legs crossed, arms folded like a meditative Buddha. He was then expected to maintain that position while one, sometimes two. Hancho shook the locker violently, jarring and teetering it erratically with greater and greater energy. All this to the accompaniment of loud, almost deafening metallic clanging and raucous laughter from everyone present. Sooner or later, the hapless recruit would tumble to the floor, and anyone not agile enough by now to light on his feet was offered no pity and spared no scorn. Occasionally also we were ordered to climb a tree near our barracks. We then had to roost there for 10 or 15 minutes, making high-pitched humming sounds like those of a cicada. This undertaking, like the preceding one, was not only amusing to our hancho, but also to the rest of us. I remember especially Oka laughing hysterically and slapping his leg while Yamamoto hummed piercingly away in the branches above. "Ah, so," the snake growled, unable to stifle his own laughter, and the cuff was half-hearted. "If you like it that much, you'd better try it yourself." Oka promptly went up the tree like a squirrel, then perched near Yamamoto, wildly trying to out-hum him. It was indeed hilarious, and those unable to contain their laughter were also ordered up the tree. Soon the branches were clustered with recruits, myself included, all emitting the weirdest sound I have ever heard. And now, as the end drew nigh, our punishment diminished. Our initial trial by fire was over, and it was also rumoured that the base commander wanted us to look hearty and healthy during our coming leave. Remarkably, the pig, Hancho Noguchi, whom many of us had sworn to kill, invited the men from the most outstanding barracks to his home in Kure for a sukiyaki dinner. Remarkably also that barracks was my own. What a weird reversal. The man we had most dreaded, the man who had been largely responsible for our constant fear and misery, for the suicide of 9 of our comrades, was now honouring us in his very home. We were respected guests. Noguchi's wife was surprisingly young and very lovely, a perfect hostess, and his 2 children, a boy and girl, ages 5 and 7, were charming. For nearly 2 hours we sat there on the tatami around a large oval table while his wife filled our bowls again and again with her cuisine or replenished our sake cups. Throughout it all the pig chatted pleasantly, occasionally cracking jokes at which we laughed most dutifully. Vainly I strove to comprehend this strange turn of events, the man's new persona. For once he seemed perfectly genuine, and in none of his conversation could I detect the faintest sarcasm or sinister nuance. When the pig spoke of punishment, he addressed us as if we were confidants who not only empathized but fully concurred. Wiping his mouth politely and sipping his sake, he confided, "In one respect, it is unfortunate that our trainees must undergo such duress. However," his sigh seemed one of honest regret, "I myself have no recourse but to obey our commanding officer, while he, in turn, must obey those above him. And so it goes all the way to our Imperial Military Headquarters, to the Daihone. The very foundation of a successful military operation is obedience, all along the chain of command." Pausing, he glanced down obliquely across his cheekbones, thrusting his chin out truculently. "Loyalty, performance of one's duty, no matter how formidable the requirement may appear, even to the forfeiting of life itself. Indeed, the forfeiting of life becomes our grand and ultimate privilege." All of us nodded sagely. Then, in a somewhat lighter tone, he recurred to his earlier reflections regarding chain of command. "The Daihone becomes unhappy with their commanding officers and reprimands them. The commanding officers become unhappy with those under them and do the same. And so it goes, on down to the Hancho and non-coms. The Hancho take it out on their trainees. And what do the poor trainees do, Kuwahara?" Firing an unexpected glance my way, he actually winked. I grinned bemusedly, shaking my head. "The trainee goes home on leave and kicks his dog," he explained. The pig slapped his thigh, laughing uproariously, and the rest of us joined in. His beautiful wife tittered, a sound of enchantment, and glanced down shyly, placing a tiny exquisite hand to her mouth. "So," he continued, chewing a mouthful of sukiyaki rigorously and swilling in half a cup of sake to wash it down. "So, my friends, obviously punishment is indispensable. Indispensable. It is the oil that makes the machinery work. Another great mouthful with the chopsticks, another draught of sake." I was beginning to understand, in more ways than one, how the pig had acquired his name. Sad to say, very few are born with the true spirit of Yamato. His eyebrows leapt, eyeballs swelling in mock amazement. "Ah-ha, does that disturb you?" Noguchi continued to devour his food for some time without further comment, and it appeared that he had lost his trend of thought. But not so. You acquire that spirit, you earn the samurai spirit through much hardship, by responding to that hardship with grand and glorious fortitude until ultimately you attain. The dramatic pause this time was most marvellous to behold, extraordinarily impressive. Invincibility. The word was like a thunderclap, a revelation, and suddenly the blood in my veins had turned to liquid fire. "So now," he continued very quietly, "have I been cruel to my Shinpei, or have I rendered them an inestimable service?" For a long time he stared into the dark, lacquered surface of the table, lips pursed in profound introspection. What he sought there, what he might descry, I did not know. Then, to my utter and ultimate astonishment, I detected a tiny drop of moisture coursing down his cheek. A tear? Could that possibly be so? Or merely a drop of sweat? The night was exceptionally warm and humid. "You must be the judge." His voice was scarcely audible. "The manner in which you answer that question will determine your future, your destiny." Noguchi discussed the matter no further that evening. Instead, he spoke of philosophy, poetry, of music. His home was filled with books, also what appeared to be costly paintings, and he expatiated upon a wide variety of subjects with impressive ease and insight. His wife then graciously played the koto, singing in a quivering, haunting, at times exquisitely lyrical, voice that caused my skin to tingle. First, the popular Kojo no Tsuki, then an ancient song I had never heard before. There, in that dimly lit room, the flowers on her kimono seemed to glow with enchantment and mystery, and the shadows on her face and hands had turned to quiet green. Half closing my lids, I watched the curve of her cheek, the delicate nostrils, how her brow vanished in the ebon flow of her hair. By squinting, I could make her hair blend with the darkness, leaving only the face, the moving lips and line of her neck. Glancing at the others, I realized that they too were spellbound. I watched the woman's graceful fingers moving along the koto strings as it lay on the table before her like the coffin of a young child. And by wishing very hard, I could obliterate everyone else in the room. Noguchi, my comrades, all gone. Now we were alone together, and soon I would draw close, looking into those liquid eyes. And when the songs had faded, she would slowly gaze at me, her face full of sorrow and immense longing, of tender inquiry. Then her lips would flow and arch in welcome, barely exposing the white of her teeth. Her hand, her heavenly hand, would reach out across the still vibrant strings of the koto to touch my own, and the intonations would blend within us. But now the music had ended. It was time to go, and we were bowing to the pig, our gracious host, thanking him profusely. Bowing, bowing. His wife, in turn, was bowing to us, laughing with the shrill, tinkling notes of a little girl, notes that were also ripe and womanly. Her laughter was not of amusement, but rather the laughter of graciousness. Again she acknowledged each of us with a bow as we filed out, each of us exactly the same. She was unaware of how close I had sat beside her, how she had reached out to me when no one else was there. Chapter 10. A Brief Reunion. So now, at last, my basic training was over. On the one hand, it seemed that time had evaporated, as though I had only arrived a few days ago. On the other, in light of all that had happened, it seemed that I had been at Hero for a great while, an entire year at least. More importantly, one way or another, I had done it. They had not broken me. At times they had come close, admittedly, but somehow I had clung on through worse trials than I could have previously imagined. I had prevailed. On the morning our leave commenced, Hero's commanding officer assembled us on the parade ground for a brief graduation address. He spoke quite generously of our accomplishments, what we had learned and why. We had been drilled daily in the basics of combat, and we were no longer the timid, whimpering juveniles of the first few weeks. We could withstand pain, and now we could not be defeated in battle without great difficulty. It was, he admitted, unfortunate that some had died, but those deaths had served a good purpose, all been part of the grand design to toughen the rest of us. Those deaths had also helped us to realize that the weakest were always the most expendable. A light mist was lacing the base that morning, but as our commander spoke, it dispersed, revealing the rising sun. The rising sun. Surely it was an omen. Our commander was a small man, but vigilant and intense, like a finely honed razor, and his entire bearing reflected confidence and power. Each gesture was unique, memorable, emphatic. We watched as the sun gathered about him, gleaming from the eagle insignias upon the visor of his cap and upon his lapels. When he had finished, 50 basic trainees chanted the main precepts of the imperial rescript without error. As our words poured forth, I could hear the throb of planes in the distance, the two sounds merging and expanding, a symbol of our newfound strength. Suddenly, I was part of something grand, something of immense and indescribable significance. There in the rising sun, I knew that the Imperial Way would not fail. I knew that it was destined to encompass the earth. So now it was over. I was returning to Onomichi on my 2-day leave before flying school. My family and several friends were gathered at the train station for the long-awaited welcome. "Toshifumi will be here this evening to see you," Tomika babbled joyfully. "Toshifumi? All the way from Tokyo, just to see me?" I exclaimed. "Well, perhaps your brother will at least say hello to the rest of us," Father said. That was the closest he ever came to levity, and we all laughed heartily. Life at that moment was too good to be real. 2 whole days, blessed days, with my family, my relatives, my friends. And upon my return to Hiro, it would not be as a green and helpless Shinpei. I would be prepared. Our home had never looked so beautiful. It was nearing the end of April, and the cherry trees in our backyard were blossoming. Everywhere throughout the entire area, tiny celestial explosions of white blossoms. The garden walls were wreathed in multicoloured azaleas, and the fields were turning bright green. It was difficult to believe that we were at war, under attack, and that soon I would be a participant. Upon entering the house, I visited briefly with my family, talked in general, rather evasively, about life at Hiro. Then I headed for the bath. Minutes later I was seated on a short-legged stool in the Udono, vigorously soaping myself, when Tomika called to me outside the door. "Brother," her voice chimed, "do you want to have your back washed?" "Yes," I called. It seemed more fitting than ever that a woman should wash my back now. After all, I had become a man. I hunched over, hugging my knees as she entered, exposing only my rounded back. What occurred next was totally unexpected. Tomika gasped, crying out, "Yasuo, what have they done to your back?" I had momentarily forgotten about the lash marks, but it was good to have her make something of the matter. "Oh, that's nothing at all. Those are merely reminders of a little game we learned," I replied. Unfortunately, my words were not to be passed off so lightly, and I had not anticipated their full effect. Concern, certainly, but my sister softly traced her fingers over the wounds, then burst into tears. "My brother, my own little brother," she wept. "Tomika, I'm all right," I insisted. "Stop crying, it's all right." The weeping continued. "Stop, I can barely even feel them. I hardly even flinched when they—" The wrong words, and I had cut them off too late. Tears flowing down her cheeks, Tomika stumbled into the adjoining alcove and cast herself onto the tatami wailing. Hearing the commotion, Mother rushed into the room with an expression of great alarm. "What's wrong?" she exclaimed. "It's nothing, Mother," I replied, almost angrily. "Just a few sores on my back." Mother cautioned Tomika to be silent, peered in at me in shocked silence. Upon entering, she began soaping my back very gently. Then she scooped a little water from the steaming bath with the wooden dipper and cautiously poured a small amount on one shoulder. "Atsui?" she asked. "Hi," I admitted, a little hot, and caught my breath as the water trickled down my back into the drain. The scars were still very new and tender, a blend of pink and grey-blue, the colour of earthworms. Gently, Mother laid a scented towel over my back, pouring the water through it with even greater care. "All right? Better?" "Hi." I nodded. Much better. It was a procedure she had followed many times before when I was a child, and it brought me great comfort. By now Tomika had regained her composure, but her cheeks still glistened. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "It was just that—" "I understand," Mother intoned. "Everything's going to be all right. Just be very careful. Getting into the bath, Yasuo. It may be too much for those tender, sore areas." A tear sparkled in her own eye. Shortly thereafter, they left me to my bath. Just be very careful getting in, Mother repeated. Cleansed and rinsed, restored to complete privacy for the first time since I had departed that winter, I eased into the waiting cauldron. I gasped as the water accosted my first lash mark. The scar seemed to writhe and cry out with a life of its own, almost renewing the pain of its origin. But, after all, I told myself, I had learned to withstand much worse trials, and I refused to be denied my bath. It was something I had dreamed of almost every night after our punishment was over. Grimacing and gritting my teeth, I lowered myself with utmost care, inch by inch, lash by lash, feeling the pain renew itself, then dissipate. Eventually, after several minutes, I was in up to my neck, the pain ebbing, replaced by pleasure, bliss, euphoria. Languorous, exhausted beyond measure, I entered my own little nirvana. Half an hour later I emerged, barely able to drag myself from the water, lying there for a time, half in half out, as the cold floor restored reality. Weakly, I dried myself, donned my yukata and slippers, and shuffled up the stairs to my room. For a moment I gazed from my window at the mountains. My eyelids closed as I kneeled there, clinging to the window ledge. I blinked, seeing a great gyrating flight of starlings, light glittering along their wings. Or was it merely dancing spots, a visual aberration or hallucination? No matter. My family and friends were gathering, and there was so much to say and do. So little time. But not now, for I was barely able to crawl beneath the futon, barely able to feel its caressing warmth, its infinite softness and lightness. Sleep was a dark and slowly whirling vortex that carried me irresistibly downward. When I revived, the sun was beginning its descent, infusing my room with gold. For a while I lay there blinking, yawned and stretched. The gold welled, achingly beautiful, and unexpectedly, without the slightest forewarning, I began to sob. An instant later I heard my door glide partly open on its rollers. No mistaking Tomika's excited whispers, but who was with her? Someone. Wiping my eyes against the futon, I bolted upright, and there he was, handsome and smiling, his hand on Tomika's shoulder, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Toshifumi!" I cried. "You came, all the way from Tokyo!" I greatly hoped that he could not detect the moisture in my eyes. Grinning more broadly, he squatted beside me and roughed my head. "Hello, Hage-chanu," he said, referring to my ragged, close-cropped hair. "So now?" He was eyeing me quizzically. "You've changed. You're almost a man." The word almost hurt, even made me a trifle angry, but I beamed back. "I hope so," I said. Toshifumi again after 2 whole years. He was not the same person who had so often grappled and cavorted with our brother Shigeru before the war. Now, dignified and handsome with a hawk-like profile, he looked more like father than ever. There was even a faint white streak in his hair, rare for a Japanese his age. Following a brief visit, he went downstairs, leaving me to dress. An hour or so later, my uncle and aunt arrived from Inoshima. My return was becoming quite an event, and despite the scarcity of food, Mother and Tomika had prepared a feast with all my favourite delicacies. How touched I was by their devotion. Again, I struggled to restrain the tears. Never before had I felt such emotional fragility. In 1944, food was heavily rationed, and Mother and Tomika had walked 2 or 3 miles into the country the day before my return to obtain whole polished rice from a farmer, a precious commodity which he refused to relinquish for mere money. Instead, Tomika had given him one of the beautiful and costly kimono, which was to have been a part of her dowry. Then they had trudged all the way home, carrying the bags of rice on their backs. An exceptional act of devotion, and I thanked them most earnestly. When I mentioned Tomika's sacrifice, she smiled and replied, "It is nothing, nothing at all. Anyway, by the time a man takes me for his wife, I will have accumulated dozens of kimono." "Oh, come now," Toshifumi chuckled, trapping a small pickle with his chopsticks and popping it into his mouth. "There are plenty of men who would be elated to have you. Just wait!" Tomika smiled wistfully, and her gaze fled to her lap. "I am waiting," she said, "and I am already 26 years old." "Tomika shall have a husband in due course," father declared, and proceeded with his food. "When we find one worthy, one of proper station." He chewed methodically, sipped his tea. "But I refuse to consider that fawning—" "Ah, what's his name? For one thing, his gestures are effeminate in the extreme. I find them highly exasperating. Furthermore, his voice—" "Must you humiliate your daughter before our relatives?" Mother chided. Her words reflected much courage, but before father could reply, Tomika arose, hiding her burning face, making swift little steps toward the door. "Tomika, come back here," father commanded. "I merely speak the truth. Don't be so touchy." After a moment, Tomika returned and sat staring at her plate. This was hardly the mood I had hoped for, and for the first time I actually felt vexed with my father. It was not my place to speak out, however, so I changed the subject. "By the way, where is Reiko?" I inquired. "Oh, we had to let her go," Mother answered quietly. She smiled at my aunt and uncle a bit ruefully. "Well, I mean, it just seemed an extravagance with the war going on and on like this, and only the three of us at home now." "Yasuo," my uncle said, "why don't you share some of your experiences at Hero with us? How did you like your training?" I hesitated. My training. I groped for words. My training was challenging, highly educational. Something of an understatement, of course, and everyone laughed as though we all shared an amusing secret. Afterward, while our women attended to work in the kitchen and their own private concerns, the rest of us talked further of my training, of the war, the military experiences of my father and uncle, of Toshifumi's dental practice in Tokyo. That evening, when my relatives had departed, I received a visit from Tatsuno. During our separation, he had sent me 2 letters, neither of which I had answered. Obviously, there had been little opportunity for such things, but I certainly could have sent him a brief note. Somehow, though, each time I considered doing so, something had stopped me. Probably it stemmed from my feeling that Tatsuno, despite his courage, was too sensitive for such an environment. He seemed too much like poor Miyagame, the recruit who had hanged himself in the latrine. Nevertheless, he would soon be there, and would have already arrived had he not torn the ligaments in his arm during a glider training mishap at school. Consequently, I felt obliged to offer him some advice. "It will be very hard," I confessed, "but remember that the first 2 months are the toughest, so start getting in condition right now. The stronger you are, the easier it will be." "Hi!" he exclaimed and nodded vigorously. "Seriously," I said, "it will make a big difference. As soon as your arm's better, start doing push-ups. Do them about 5 times a day and build up to at least 50 each set. And how's your endurance? If you can double time 3 or 4 miles when you go in, that will help a lot too." I then stressed the importance of being respectful to his hancho and avoiding actions that would attract unnecessary attention. "Remember not to make any noise no matter what when they hit you in the rear with a ball bat, or you'll just get more. And don't move. Just cling onto the rail and grit your teeth, and when they start to slam your face against the wall, just tilt your head forward a little. Not so it's noticeable, though, or they'll do it again twice as hard. Just do it a little," I persisted. "That way you'll get a bump on your forehead, but it won't mangle your nose and mouth very much. And another thing, tell everybody in your barracks to write home and warn their families not to bring them special treats when they come to visit. If even one recruit gets something and tries to hide it, believe me, your hancho will find out, and there will be serious trouble." I decided to avoid the details, for suddenly Tatsuno's face was grey. "I'm sorry," I said, and felt guilty. On the other hand, I'd have felt far more guilty had I failed to prepare him in some measure. "You'll get through it all right," I assured him, trying hard to believe my own words. Just take it one day at a time. I shrugged. After all, what about me? Don't I look all right? You look terrific, he said. His tone sounded slightly envious. But your face has quite a few sores and scars. A few, I admitted, but I'm perfectly all right, and if I can make it through and come out this well, so can you. Besides, when we're flying those fighter planes, we'll be tough as sumo wrestlers. Tatsuno laughed. But not as big and fat. Right, lean and hard, muscles from our toes to our nose. Seriously, we'll be ready for anything. Tatsuno's smile became mournful, the expression in his eyes uncertain. Yasuo, he said, remember how we used to dream of flying together, fighter pilots, in the same squadron? Of course, I said, and we will. Tatsuno shook his head. I doubt it. You're already too far ahead of me. Well, we might not end up in the same squadron, I admitted, but we'll both be flying. That's what matters most. Again he shook his head. Yasuo, he said, I'm afraid. I really wonder whether I can make it through that first 3 months. You'll make it, I insisted. Don't you think I was afraid at first? Everybody is. I don't care who. And 3 months seems like a long time in the beginning, but now I can't believe where it's gone. You'll make it through as well, or better than I did. Then before you know it, you'll be in fighter school. It sounds good, he said. It is good, I persisted. Besides, we've always been a winning team, haven't we? We'll be flying together yet, Tatsu-kun, I can feel it. I hope so, he said. Well, I'd better let you get back to your family. He gave me a pat on the shoulder, and I clasped his forearm. Thanks for coming, Tomodachi, I said. You're my best friend ever. Arigato, he said. The same to you, and started down the stairs. See you later. Right, I nodded. In the morning, I'll be coming by the school. The sudden attention of family, relatives, and friends was most gratifying, and I was fast becoming a hero. During my first day at home, I had uttered all the patriotic platitudes that were expected. I had felt a powerful surge of determination and courage, and I was viewing the hell of basic in a different light. Later that night, having talked again at length with Father and Toshifumi, I went to my room tingling with pride and elation. From my open window I gazed at the rising moon. It hung there in the sky as it had the night of my first departure, evanescent and faintly glowing like a thin silver bracelet. As I lay back and drifted off to sleep, Hiro seemed very remote, strangely unreal. For the moment, I was totally at peace. The following morning, my school friends greeted me as though I had already performed deeds of great valour. Daily before classes, a general assembly was held in the auditorium. During my visit, however, the announcements were dispensed with, and I was asked to address the students. The thought of speaking extemporaneously was frightening, but several insistent teachers ushered me forward amid much loud cheering and laughter. To my surprise, I spoke rather easily for about 10 minutes. I never mentioned the pig, Taiko Binta, the deserters, or suicides. One simply did not refer to such things in public. Instead, I described the rigours of combat training, of the great conditioning, and talked of the classwork. I spoke of our divine heritage as sons and daughters of Nippon, of our future, and of the obligation of all able-bodied young men to serve their country. Closing, I bowed to a rousing ovation. Our weathered old principal Horikacho then addressed us briefly in his familiar quavering voice as follows. This school is honoured and proud to have helped mould such outstanding citizens. We will follow Yasuo Kuwahara's future accomplishments with constant interest, and we will all rejoice as he continues to discharge his sacred obligation to our Emperor and to the glorious nation of Nippon. May all of you here today note with care his stellar example and follow in his path. I left Onomichi High School unaware that my next and only return would be under very different circumstances. The remainder of that day I visited a few friends, one of whom was soon to enter the Marines. Then I spent the final hours with my family, and we spoke for some time about my brother Shigeru. No word from him for weeks, and our concern was increasing. As a captain in the counterintelligence in Java, he could reveal little regarding his work. A few months earlier, however, one of his rare messages indicated that he was well, but also concluded as follows: "If you should not hear from me again, I will await your visit to the Yasukuni Jinja, the national shrine for Japan's military dead." Shortly after supper, we saw Toshifumi off on his train for Tokyo. My leave had vanished with inconceivable speed. I had barely found time to relax and breathe normally, and now it was over. Just before midnight, I bid Tomika and Mother sayonara, for the third time in 3 months. Even though I was returning with greater confidence, the anxiety was mounting again, and I concluded that farewells never become much easier. Father accompanied me to the station where, to my amazement, a crowd of some 250 students were awaiting me, a brass band playing. Shouts arose at our approach, and a cordon of friends pressed in to clasp my hand and offer their best wishes. Father had never looked more proud. I was also presented with gifts, including the school pendant and several autographed flags of Japan. Some of those students had actually cut their own fingers and signed their names with blood in a token of eternal friendship. I was to wear these mementos as scarves into battle, and now only minutes remained. "Well," I said, and glanced at the train nervously. "Maybe I'd better—" "Yasuo!" someone called. It was Tatsuno, there on the crowd's fringe, wriggling toward me. In a moment we were clasping each other like brothers. "I'll be seeing you soon, Tatsuno-kun," I said. "Don't forget what I told you." "Speech, Kuwahara, speech!" someone bellowed, and several others chimed in. "I gave my speech already," I told them. "This morning." "Yes, but we need one now." The band was playing Light of the Firefly, a bit blatantly and off-key, but it brought back a tide of memories, and my eyes began to smart. Watching their smiling faces, I mumbled, "I hope many of you will follow me. Until then, sayonara." The conductor's voice was a plaintive, nasal twang, sounding departure amid the flurry of goodbyes from my friends. Moments later, the train was click-clacking toward Hiro, gaining momentum, and I was still hearing my father's parting admonition. "In all things, be sure to conduct yourself with honor, my son. Remember now that your life is no longer your own. If you should ever fall into dishonor, do not return to bring unhappiness and shame upon us. Live proudly, fight gloriously. Should you die, I will have a grave prepared." Gripping my hand fiercely and gazing into my eyes, he inquired, "Do you know my heart?" As the train tunneled onward into the night, I watched my own reflection in the window, a transparent ghost of myself through which I could see the receding lights of town. Suddenly I felt a profound need to remember everything, to lodge somewhere in my mind and heart a picture of the past. Family, friends, places, the ocean on a wintry day, fishermen with their nets, the sunlight and lofting winds of Mat Ikoma, greening rice fields, the moon balanced upon our trellis, and the smell of azaleas. All that and much more, a poignant need to store it all away in some special place, safe from the ravages of war and the erosion of time. Part 3. Chapter 11. The Praying Mantis. Flying school, as I had anticipated, was much better than basic training, although the punishment and arduous conditioning continued. We had formed friendships and were hardened both physically and mentally. I was elated to discover that all the survivors from our original group were assigned to another 4-section barracks together. Each section housed 15 men as before, but our quarters were somewhat better, and we lived on a separate part of the base near the pilots. Although most of our airmen were not much older than the rest of us, we regarded them as a proud, audacious lot, and with a certain awe. Daily we watched their flight performances with excitement and admiration. They were the ultimate warriors, the eagles who, above all others, would lead us to victory. We were now designated the 4th Squadron, and the first stage of our 6-month course involved an intensive study of aeronautics. We also began learning to parachute. We did not begin flying, however, for 3 months, and then only in a small biplane called the Akatombo, Red Dragonfly, with cockpits for both the instructor and student. Unfortunately, our new Hancho were just as harsh and cruel as the pig and his cohorts had been. Rentaro Namoto, our first sergeant and flight instructor, was called the Praying Mantis because of his lean, insectivorous appearance and vicious nature. Unlike that of the pig, his personality had few dimensions. He rarely joked or laughed, and was by very nature, it seemed, unlikable. Nevertheless, he possessed remarkable skill and cunning. Nearly 6 feet tall, with a supple whip-like body, Sergeant Namoto was the coldest, most calculating man I had ever encountered. When he inflicted punishment, it was devoid of all outward emotion, every movement methodical and precise like that of a robot. During most of our basic training, we had been utterly bewildered and terrified. The sudden insecurity of being wrenched from our families, the fear of the unknown, the softness of our minds and bodies, the constant pain, anxiety, and humiliation had made life an almost incessant nightmare. Now, however, we were undergoing a metamorphosis. Very surreptitiously at first, we began striking back at our tyrants. Few crimes are greater in the military, especially the Japanese military, than disobedience or outright defiance in particular. Such things automatically incurred severe retribution, if not destruction. Open disobedience, or defiance in fact, had terrible implications, and not only meant that one was insulting his immediate superiors, but also his commanding officer, the Diahone in Tokyo, indeed, ultimately, even the emperor himself. Subtle misdeeds, on the other hand, were viewed somewhat differently, perhaps because they were more consistent with the covert and cunning elements of our general makeup. Although never acknowledged openly, our chicanery with the Mantis developed into a kind of game which ultimately he always managed to win. Our first efforts in that regard occurred one day before evening chow, just after we had been required to perform the low crawl, wriggling along on our bellies across 300 yards of hot air strip. As the KP was carrying Namoto's evening meal to his quarters, Oka called out softly, "Yai, Furuhashi, wait up! We have some special seasoning for our leader's rice." "What?" Furuhashi glanced back nervously. "Hey, you'd better not do anything," he protested as we approached. "Look now, don't do that. Hey, don't. Do you want to get us all killed?" "He'll never know a thing," Nakamura insisted. "If you'd just stop squealing like a stuck pig for a minute." By now, all of us were taking turns vigorously massaging and scratching our scalps over the steaming bowl of rice. Despite the KP's terrified protests, we managed to deposit a large quantity of dandruff in the bowl. "Now," Nakamura patted his forlorn shoulder, "mix the seasoning in well. This is our special gift to the Mantis because we all love him so dearly." Reluctantly, the KP went on his way, shaking his head and muttering a few appropriate curses. Secluding ourselves, we watched him enter the Mantis's room. A few seconds later, he returned, empty-handed. "Is he eating his rice like a good boy?" I asked. Yes, the KP muttered and stalked back toward the chow hall. "Hey, does he really like it?" Oka called from the barracks doorway. "Did he kiss your lovely little hand?" "Go screw yourself," the KP growled. Truly, this was a splendid way of retaliating. It didn't matter to us that the Mantis was unaware of his humiliation. The important fact existed that he was being humiliated. His ignorance of such indignity only made it better. That way also there would be no reprisal, or so we hoped. Our first rice seasoning escapade had been so successful, in fact, that we determined to follow the same procedure regularly. Almost every evening we seasoned Namoto's supper in like manner, and before long Oka ingeniously suggested that we mix in a little of our excrement for variety. Yamamoto agreed, but maintained that we try urine first, since, presumably, it would be less detectable. We were seriously considering those recommendations when something unexpected happened. Moriyama, another KP, became especially nervous one evening when nearly a dozen of us approached him for the standard dandruff application. "All of you can't put your dandruff in the rice," he moaned. "The mantis will notice it. Why don't we forget about the whole thing for a while? This is really getting dangerous, and you're pressing your luck." "Oh yes," Nakamura said. "Since it's your turn at KP, why don't we just forget about it for a while? We'll all be taking our turn, so don't be a spineless jellyfish." "I'm no more jellyfish than you are," Moriyama countered angrily. "I'm just not as stupid." Eventually, however, after much cajolery, he capitulated. "But come on now," he whined. "Not all of you. You'll flood the bowl over." No, we need everybody," Oka declared. "Some of us are running low on dandruff." This to the accompaniment of much half-smothered laughter, and the first man proceeded to make his offering. "Next," he said briskly, and I stepped forward, each of the others following suit. "Now mix it in, Moriyama," I advised. "If you don't, our friend will know." "Mix it with what?" he asked. "I've got to hurry, or he'll be coming out here to see what's happening." "Use your fingers, naturally," someone said. Reluctantly, Moriyama began to probe with his fingers. "God, this is hot," he complained. "Brave samurai," Yamamoto said. "Be a brave, brave samurai." Again Moriyama complied. "Now, what do I wipe them with?" "Just lick them off," Yamamoto said. "That's the quickest way." Again he complied, or at least began to. Suddenly he stopped, fingers only an inch from his extended tongue as though frozen, and again we shook with strangled laughter. Moriyama appeared to be on the verge of vomiting. "Bakayaro!" he cursed, then went his way like a man expecting the firing squad. With the door to Namoto's room slightly ajar, we listened intently, pressing close to the wall just outside. Moriyama had apparently turned to leave when the mantis spoke, his words resonating harshly. "Kindly wait 1 minute, my friend." "Yes, Honourable Honcho Dono," Moriyama quavered. A long silence then ensued, but finally the dreaded voice spoke again. "This rice. It stinks. What makes it so putrid and oily? It stinks like hell. Where did you get it? From the latrine?" "Let's get out of here," someone warned, "before it's too late." A moment later we heard a crash and then what sounded like a blow, perhaps a terrific boot in the rear. "Quick! Outside!" I hissed as Moriyama stumbled out the door, the remains of Namoto's feast plastering the back of his head, dribbling down his neck and face. "We're in for it now," Moriyama gasped. "He'll skin us all alive." This time no one argued. Instead, we fled to our barracks and waited out the night in great anxiety. To our growing astonishment, however, nothing happened until the following morning. Namoto's response, in fact, was far less virulent than we had anticipated, though certainly more ingenious. It was reveille formation, and we stood stiffly at attention, perhaps even holding our breath, as the mantis surveyed us all thoughtfully. A flight of fighter planes was circling overhead, coming in to land a short distance off. "It appears," he spoke in loud, high-pitched tones, penetrating the sound of their motors. "It appears." Again his words were obliterated as the first fighter arched by with a ferocious roar and began its final descent. "Eyes straight ahead." The plane landed with a lurch and screech of rubber. "Doesn't know how to handle it very well, does he?" For a moment it seemed as though he were simply talking to himself. "As I was saying," he continued, "it appears that some of you men have become concerned about my health." Another pause while the next plane headed in. "You have been supplementing my diet. Maybe you think I too skinny. Nah." He paused, eyeing us calculatingly. "In any case, even though I am doing well, I want you to know that I appreciate your kindness. Of course, it is only natural to love your instructors. When I was a trainee, we loved our instructors. We were concerned about their health, just as you are. OK made a strange little noise like a spurt of air from a valve. Shh, I hissed. The mantis appeared to take no notice. However, you may put your minds at ease. We instructors are well fed, and there is no need for concern. As a matter of fact, last night, when our KP brought my dinner, I wasn't even hungry. I actually gave it all back to him. I glanced at Oka and Yamamoto from the corners of my eyes, and realized that they were struggling desperately to avoid laughing. Terribly sloppy eater, though. They both wheezed, and I began to pray that they would be able to contain themselves. So, he raised a rapier-like forefinger, to demonstrate my appreciation for your kindness, I wish to propose a toast, Hancho Kitamura, Hancho Mukai. 2 Hancho hastened among us, distributing sake cups, and we watched in growing amazement as they proceeded to fill them from a gigantic blue bottle. Be at ease, Namoto instructed. Wonderful awamore sake all the way from Okinawa. We were all dumbfounded. Could this possibly be an actual salute to our cleverness? Our ingenuity? Dozo, fine, the mantis observed. So now I propose a toast to all of you, to the men of the 4th Squadron. Kampai. Kampai! Bottoms up! We cried in unison. To the men of the 4th Squadron. We downed our drinks as one, and it took a few moments for us to realize what had happened. Each man's mouth had turned dark blue. The awful tasting elixir was ink. For a while we played no more tricks. Tatsuno had arrived at Hero and was undergoing the hell of early basic, living in the same barracks that I had. Fortunately, he had known quite clearly what to expect and had prepared himself as well as possible, but on our rare encounters I continued to offer advice. One night I was quietly conversing with Tatsuno outside his quarters when the pig passed us carrying 2 of his beloved ball bats. For a moment I didn't think he had noticed me, but upon leaning his bats against the wall he turned back and remarked, "Ah, so? The mighty Kuwahara has returned." Then he glanced at Tatsuno. "You see how attached these men become to their first home away from home? They can't stay away, right, Kuwahara?" He actually gave my shoulder a friendly pat as he entered the barracks. "Hi, Honourable Hancho Dono," I called. I no longer hated the pig, and even felt a minor thrill at being recognised and worthy of his attention. "Looks as if we're going to get some more of the fighting spirit," Tatsuno observed wryly. "I'd better go in." "No, stay outside a minute," I said. "If he herds them out now, there won't even be a roll call. It's not even 8 o'clock, and he won't notice whether you're missing." Tatsuno was understandably fearful, but I suggested that he follow me behind some shrubbery a short distance away. "If they start calling the roll," I advised, "we can hear them. You can just walk up and get into the rear of the formation." Still dubious, he relaxed a bit, and we strolled back to sit down behind the bushes. Moments later, to our surprise, the pig emerged from the barracks and headed for his quarters. "There goes the strangest man I have ever known," I said. We remained there conversing until nearly time for Shoto Rapper, then parted. "Maybe they won't even harass you tonight," I added. "I hope so," Tatsuno replied. "I hope the Mantas and his friends won't harass you." That was the last we saw of each other for some time. My first 3 months of flight school raced by far more rapidly than basic training, largely because I was learning to fly. At last, I was actually training in a power-driven aircraft. I will never forget those first days in the Akatombo, and I took to the new trainers as readily as I had to the gliders. I had studied aeronautics zealously, and at times the Mantis or one of the other instructors warned me against being too eager. So thoroughly had I familiarized myself with the instrument panel, the entire flight operation, I secretly felt that I could take off and land unassisted my first time in the cockpit. During my hours in the air, watching the earth transform voluptuously beneath me, I felt an exhilaration and power that dispelled all the unpleasant and painful associations of the past. Fear, unhappiness, and frustration all receded earthward as I became at one with the sky. Nothing could harm me in that new and magic domain. It was mine, and I belonged there. Our hours on the ground were a vivid contrast. Steadily, relentlessly, the Mantis and his cohorts poured on the punishment. Because it took more to break us, he gave more, and the anger and bitterness were mounting. Several men threatened to kill him, and someone even managed to procure poison, planning to place it in his food. Nakamura considered the idea quite amusing, insisting that since our dandruff had failed to kill him, nothing could. Fortunately for all of us, those in favour of it were finally dissuaded after much heated argument. The Mantis had a large whip which he cracked at the slightest provocation. He handled it with admirable finesse, and with little exertion often inflicted excruciating pain. One day, after several of us had received a lashing, we gathered behind an empty warehouse to concoct more retaliation. Everyone knew by now that the Mantis went to town each night, where he drank heavily and often caroused with prostitutes. It was said that he could consume alcohol endlessly and still only become mildly intoxicated. Furthermore, according to one of the fighter pilots, he was a satyr supreme who performed incredible sexual feats, whose fire was never quenched. All this, of course, seemed to contradict our image of that fish-cold, metal-eyed individual with whom we had to cope each day. Every evening Nomoto left for town at 7 or 8 o'clock. Then, about midnight, he returned, weaving his way along the hall and crunching on down the short flight of stairs to his room at the end of the barracks. Thus originated our plan, and we awaited its realization one night with much interest. As midnight approached, we were poised tensely in our own quarters, listening for the sound of his arrival. An hour passed, and we drifted in and out of sleep, assuming at last that he would not return until morning. Eventually, though, the door banged, and footsteps echoed down the hall, followed shortly by a resounding crash. Every man in the barracks was undoubtedly wide awake, tense and listening, but also highly gratified. The taut rope we had stretched across the stairway only a few inches above the floor had done its job. The next morning the Mantis appeared at formation with a bandage across his nose. Never cracking a smile as usual, he paced back and forth before us, hands clasped behind his back, trailing his whip like a great rat-tail. At length he faced the formation and spoke. "I am pleased to note that some of you are such practical jokers. A good sense of humour is often very refreshing." All of the 4th Squadron knew by then what had happened. "So, today," he continued, and the words were rather adenoidal because of his swollen nose, "I have prepared a little joke of my own, just to show you I am not thoughtless and unappreciative. This afternoon, when the day is pleasant and warm, you will wear your flying suits." He paused for a moment, allowing the prospect to register. Quite humorous, wouldn't you agree? We awaited the afternoon with mounting apprehension, but during the morning Nomoto and his assistants scarcely laid a hand on us. Clearly it was the lull before the storm. Then, at last, the fated time arrived, and, true to his word, the Mantis had us don all of our flying accoutrements, our feather-lined suits, boots, leather helmets and scarves, even our parachute packs. Heat waves were shimmering on the airstrip as we commenced our usual hour of calisthenics, the weather extremely hot and humid. For the first few minutes our flying suits served as protection from the sun. One or two of the men even suggested that we should always wear flying suits, but I was highly sceptical. Already the first few drops of sweat had formed under my arms and begun trickling down my side. The heat was building from within and had no means of escape. "In about 5 minutes you'll find out how crazy you are," I informed one of the more optimistic. "Oh, come on now, Kuwahara," he retorted. "Don't always be such a pessimist." We were doing push-ups side by side, and I grunted, "You'll be changing your mind before it's over, my friend." "No, I won't." "Fool! Boob!" Never before had anyone intimated that I was a boob. Unreasonably furious, I got to my feet. "Stand up, Shinpei," I said, "and we'll see who the boob is." Obligingly, he arose, grinning impudently, and I struck with all my strength, staggering him, but also losing my balance. We fell in a tangle among the other men, grappling awkwardly. There were curses, our comrades grabbing and separating us. Nakamura had hold of my arms. "Ease up," he urged. "Do you want to get killed?" By then, however, the mantis was lashing away at us, though with only moderate effect because of our thick flying suits. As we stood, panting, I was still seething with anger, literally trembling, but I also realized my stupidity. Already burning inside, I continued to pant, my throat dust dry. Sweat was seeping from my forehead into my eyes, blurring the backs of the men before me. I was quivering uncontrollably now, and my legs felt hollow. I refused to look at Tanaka, the man I had fought. At the conclusion of our calisthenics 15 minutes later, we were virtually broiling in our suits, and that was only the beginning. Now it was time for our daily running. We moved out like elephants in our heavy clothing under a blazing sun, and once I removed one of my gloves to test the heat of my flying suit. Its hot leather almost scorched my hand, and we lumbered steadily forward down the vast concrete expanse of our airfield. Meanwhile, the mantis pedalled comfortably along beside us on his bicycle, dressed in nothing but his lightweight fatigues. The land of concrete seemed to stretch interminably, and at length I began to reflect upon the declaration of our commanding officer at the end of basic training. The imperial way is a long way, never ending. The imperial way will never end. Long, the words came. Long, long, repeating themselves regularly with every other stride. Yet now I could see only a short distance through my sweat-filled eyes. The Japanese way of life was destined to fill the earth, as we were often told. Perhaps that was why it had to be such a long, hard way. Minute after minute our boots clumped rhythmically forward. Long, long, long. Intermittently my vision cleared, but why had I ever imagined that there was an end to the airfield? And what direction were we going? I had no idea. On and on we went, boots clumping steadily, and gradually it seemed that there were fewer men behind me. Ahead, someone staggered and hit the concrete rolling. The runway was rocking now. 30 seconds later, another man grabbed his stomach, staggered and went down. As I passed his inert form, it seemed a bit as though he was sinking like a leaky boat into a flat grey sea. Another man was going down now, tripping the one behind him. They too seemed to be vanishing, sinking inexorably into the concrete. Their bodies, I told myself, would become a part of it, and years hence, when men broke up this strip to build a new one, they would find the remnants, mere hollow statues. But even then I would still be running beneath the inferno of the sun, onward and onward into infinity. On the other hand, perhaps I too would ultimately become a statue. If I were a statue with the rest, I could be at peace. There in our family shrine I would know the inestimable bliss of nothingness. There in the cool of evening under the trees among the flowers, the cicadas singing, and Tomika would come quietly each day to cool the hard stone of my being with her tears. She would whisper, "My brother, my dearest brother." I never felt the airstrip rising to meet me. Tepid liquid from a canteen sloshed against my face, and I saw the spokes of a bicycle wheel whirling by.